Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the March meeting of the Wilmot Township Committee of Adjustment. I would like to introduce members of our committee. We have Mr. Steve Miller, Mr. Tyler Bowman, Mr. Peter Rowe, and of course, Miss Louise Lalonde. Also with us, we have Mr. Andrew Martin, who is the Manager of Planning for the Township of Wilmot and our Secretary Treasurer, as well as Mr. Cameron Miller, who will be introducing all of our applications this evening. I'm not aware of any Indigenous person who wishes to read the land acknowledgement agreement from the township, so I will do so. We have gathered in Wilmot Township on the traditional territory of the Neutral, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee and the Mississauga peoples. We also want to acknowledge the importance of the Dish of the One Spoon Covenant, a peace agreement made between indigenous nations before the Europeans arrived. It characterizes our collective responsibility to each other and to Mother Earth. We should take only what we need and leave enough for others and keep the dish clean. By acknowledging this covenant and the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, we are reminded of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work together as a community. My name is Wayne Roth, and we are an independent body appointed by the Wilmot Township Council. We have the power to make minor changes to existing zoning regulations and to approve some changes to existing non-conforming uses, as well as to give consent. Each application will be noted in writing of the decision of this committee within 10 days, and with that decision will be instructions on how it can be appealed. Any decision made by this committee can be appealed to the Land Tribunal of Ontario, who will then hold a meeting and make a final and binding decision. If the decision on a consent or a minor variance is not appealed, it will become final and binding after 20 days from the decision of this meeting. The format of the meeting will be as follows. We will ask Mr. Miller to introduce each application. The applicant will then be invited to make comments and add any additional information if they choose to do so. Following this, anyone in the audience or who has registered will have the opportunity to speak for or against this application. Committee members may then question the applicant and or anyone else who speaks. The committee will then make a decision. Mr. Miller, would you please introduce our first application?
Thank you, Mr. Roth. The first application is a minor variance application concerning 53 Mitchell Street in New Dundee, A04/21. This application seeking to reduce the exterior side yard setback of a single detached dwelling from 6 meters to approximately 4.27 meters. So the property is currently developed with a single detached dwelling that's fronting onto Mitchell Street. The applicant is proposing to demolish the existing dwelling and reconstruct a new dwelling that fronts onto North Street. As shown in the attached sketch, the applicant's proposal does meet the required front yard setback, but is proposing a reduction in the exterior side yard setback. Staff are of the opinion that this setback is consistent with existing homes on North Street, and it will not result in any visibility concerns as it maintains the required corner visibility triangle. The property is regulated by the Grand River Conservation Authority. As such, they have been involved throughout the process with the applicant, and they've indicated that they have no concerns with the proposal. In part, the proposed configuration of the home is necessary to provide adequate space for a conventional septic system while also satisfying GRCA regulations. As part of a subsequent building permit process, should the application be approved, the applicant would also be required to obtain a permit from GRCA. No objections were raised, and staff are recommending that the application therefore be approved.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. I must apologize. Before this application, I should have asked, is there any pecuniary interest of members of committee? I assume there are none. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Miller. Does the applicant wish to address the committee on this matter, Mr. Martin?
I have just added him to the meeting. If he'd like to have say anything, he can at this point.
No?
No, I'm good.
Okay, everything is fine then. Members of committee, any comments or questions? Seeing none, I would then ask for a motion to approve this recommendation. Moved by Ms. Lalonde, seconded by Mr. Bowman. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing no discussion, all in favor? The motion is carried. Thank you very much. Mr. Miller, would you introduce the second application here?
Thanks again, Mr. Oath. The next application is also a minor variance application concerning 3429 Herbs Road. This application is proposing to increase the maximum allowable lot coverage of a building containing an additional dwelling unit from 75% of the lot coverage of the main dwelling to approximately 85%. So the current zoning does permit an additional dwelling unit, essentially is just a residential unit within an accessory building. Of which the area does not exceed 75% of the main lot coverage of the main dwelling. The intent in part of this size requirement was to ensure that the additional dwelling unit remains secondary to the main dwelling. So there are no explicit maximum area regulations for a building without a dwelling unit, but through adding a unit, it's therefore subject to those regulations. The applicant's just proposing to convert a small portion of the building, approximately 78 square meters or 32% of the building's total area, to an additional dwelling unit, and the rest will remain as a accessory building. So given only a portion of the building is being used as an additional dwelling unit, staff are of the opinion that the size increase is minor and is maintaining the overall intent of the zoning bylaw, and are recommending that the application be approved.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Again, does the applicant wish to make any additional comments, Mr. Martin?
They are just joining the meeting here, and they'll have an opportunity when they're in.
Mr. and Mrs. Shantz, do you have anything that you wish to add? I don't see a response, so.
I have nothing to add at this point.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Members of committee, any comments or questions regarding this application? Seeing none, could someone move that we approve this application? Moved by Mr. Rowe, seconded by Mr. Miller. Any comments or questions on the motion? If not, all in favor? That motion is carried. Thank you very much. Mr. Miller, would you introduce the next application?
Thanks again, Mr. Roth. Moving on to the consent applications. The first consent application is BO2/21. It concerns 42 and 44 Foundry Street in Basin. This application is seeking to split the subject property in order to divide ownership of a semi-detached dwelling. The resulting retained and severed parcels are each approximately 450 meters in size, 450 square meters, sorry, which does well exceed the lot area requirements for a semi within Zone 3. Through circulation, the Region of Waterloo has provided comments requiring the dedication of a road allowance of approximately 13 feet. That has been outlined in the report as well as on the sketch. No concerns were raised in circulating the application, and staff are also recommending that this application be approved, subject to a number of standard conditions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miller. Does the applicant wish to comment on this application, Mr. Martin?
The applicant isn't in attendance, and there are no registered delegations for this application.
Okay, thank you very much. This is kind of an interesting one for me. Because I spent 26 years of my life on 44 Foundry Street until my mother finally kicked me out. But times are changing and things move forward. So nonetheless, it's still interesting to see how, a community that you grew up in is changing. Nonetheless, thank you very much. Members of the committee, any comments or questions on this application? Seeing none, would someone bring forth a motion to approve? Moved by Mr. Bowman, seconded by Ms. Lalonde. Is there any discussion on the motion? If not, that motion is carried. Thank you very much. Mr. Miller, would you introduce the next one, please?
Thank you, Mr. Oath. The next application is a consent application VO3/21 concerning 4 and 6 Louisa Street. So this application is proposing to sever lands for the purposes of dividing ownership of a semi-detached dwelling currently under construction. The application will also result in a retained parcel having the potential to be developed with a semi-detached dwelling as well. So it is important to note that the location of the current dwelling under construction does fully comply with all the regulations of the Township zoning bylaw. The building exceeds the minimum setbacks and off-street parking is provided in excess of the minimum requirements in the zoning bylaw. So to date, the Township has not received any written concerns, but I wanted to take an opportunity to address some of the verbal concerns that we've received in circulating the application. I know the delegates will have an opportunity to speak as well following my presentation. So regarding public notification, there was some question as to why nearby residents weren't notified sooner regarding the redevelopment. Up until this point, redevelopment of the property has been in full compliance with the existing zoning regulations. The current zoning does permit a semi-detached dwelling with accessory apartments, and that is what is presently being constructed. When an application for consent was filed, public notice was given in excess of the 14-day requirement outlined in the Planning Act. Public notice was given and a sign was posted on February 11th, which is approximately 20 days before tonight's meeting, to give ample time for nearby residents to provide comment. So it is common for division of ownership of a semi to occur after the foundation has been poured so that the survey can more accurately account for the common center line of the property. Regarding drainage, again, there will be some further comment on this, but in summary, a lot grading and drainage plan was approved by the Township Public Works Department to ensure that there is no negative impacts on neighboring properties. And likewise, as part of a subsequent building permit process for the vacant retained parcel, a lot grading and drainage plan would also be required to ensure that drainage does not negatively impact any abutting properties. And then finally, quickly to do with traffic. The application was reviewed by both the Region of Waterloo and the Township of Wilmot from a transportation engineering perspective, in which it did not result in any requests to review traffic impacts from the existing and potential future development. The modified driveway locations received the necessary access permit approvals from the Township of Wilmot's Public Works Department. And then so finally, given that this application simply is proposing to separate ownership of a semi-detached dwelling and results in lot sizes that fully comply with the applicable zoning regulations, staff are recommending approval of the consent.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miller. Mr. Martin, does the applicant wish to address the committee on this matter?
The applicant is not in attendance, so we do have a number of registered delegations. If you'd like me to start adding those in.
Would you introduce each delegation in order then, please, Mr. Martin?
All right, so the first registrant is Brian Miller. I do see that he is connected twice, so if he could select the raise hand option so I know which person to bring into the meeting right now, that would be appreciated. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a raise hand option, Mr. Miller. He's not raising his hand, so I'm going to add the first person that's listed first, Brian Miller. Oh, here we go. All right, he's joining the meeting right now.
Mr. Miller, welcome to the meeting. Andrew, I see his name, but I don't see his connection.
He's currently muted. Right, there we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Mr. Miller.
Okay, I live adjacent to the property, and the previous owner, the land was basically, that lot was flat in comparison to mine. Since the foundation has been put in and the grading done, just by eye, my opinion is it's at least 18 inches higher than it was. Now, both of us share a yard in the back of my property. It would be adjacent to her, this property is adjacent to my backyard. Anyways, there's a low-lying area there. And water ends up in my backyard in a normal year. It ended up in that yard on a normal year. My concern now is that the property is no longer level, that with this new grading, there's going to be an overflow of water from that property onto mine. There is no drainage. I have talked to Andrew about this. The drainage, he says, on Foundry Street is higher than Louisa Street, so it's not going to get there. The drainage on Tannery Street, the water has never made it from my property or the Bell property, which is in my backyard, has never ever made it to that drain. That water pools on the Bell property in some years up to a 40 diameter little pond in the spring. So that water is not going to make it to any drain. This is my concern. There's no drains, and the present grading shows that it's going to drain towards my property. That's my concern. I haven't really been addressed on it by Andrew. He seems to think differently. I've done a little research on this, and the attitude I was sort of given that it's going to be a wait and see thing. If there's an issue, it'll be corrected. So I really don't have any other way to turn concerning this issue with my property, but I have done a little research, and if the information I have gathered so far is correct, a portion of that property falls under the Grand River Conservation Area, the Grand River Conservation Area Authority. So if I do have any concerns, I guess in the future, that's the people I will be approaching. I have to investigate this more. This is only right now new information I just gathered. My other concern is where the driveways enter Louisa Street. That was a low-lying area, which now will not exist. When it rains on our streets, the road is higher than the driveways. So water runs into every property at that end of the street. If we have significant rain, you can't use the sidewalk. It's underwater. It's a stream. It never makes it to the drain on Foundry Street. At best, it runs down the sidewalk on Foundry Street. We've addressed these issues time and time again. The road was supposed to be upgraded years ago. We're told, no, that didn't exist. That never was going to happen. Well, I have under advisement from the ward counselor at that time for this area. He will back me up. Yes, it was. There was upgrades supposed to be done. They haven't happened. My concern is now you're adding to a bad situation. The street is terribly narrow. It is the only access, or not the only access, but it is major access to the expressway out of the subdivision, Schneller Drive, in behind the ballpark, all them streets back there. Not all the residents, but the majority of residents enter from Louisa Street to the expressway. This street is only 21 feet wide. Just to give you an example how narrow it is, when school buses approach each other in opposing directions, one stops so the other can pass so their mirrors don't hit. We've addressed these issues time and time again. It's not being dealt with. Now you're going to add more properties, more problems with drainage. It can only get worse. All the residents on this street, at least on this end of Louisa Street, close to where this is happening, are terribly frustrated. I've had people, all 4 tires, drive across my front lawn because there's a car in the road. There's nowhere to go. I've dealt with these issues. I kept them to myself mostly, but yeah, I'm basically done with it. The only reason I oppose this development is because you haven't upgraded the street. The street is not capable of taking any more water on. It also is a hazard, a very big safety hazard. That's the only issue we have. And many more of the delegates you talk to are going to make the same statement. We are frustrated. And I think I'll just leave it at that before I say something I'll regret.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions from members of committee? I have one, Mr. Andrew, Mr. Martin. I'm not aware that there is any plan, either on a 10-year or 20-year plan for the upgrade of Louisa Street. Am I correct in that, or is that been changed?
I have had a conversation with our Public Works and Engineering Department, and they're aware of some of the concerns that have been raised. The actual intersection, Foundry Street, is planned to be reconstructed by the Region of Waterloo, which will address some of the concerns at the intersection. Louisa Street itself, at this point, there aren't any plans for reconstruction, but my understanding from Public Works and Engineering is, as concerns have been raised, there is an opportunity to look at those matters and see if there's a way to correct them. I guess the important part, and what we've tried to explain, is that this application doesn't trigger those road improvements. The road improvements, if there is deficiencies, exist now, and so it's something that our Public Works and Engineering Department would need to review and look at, but it's not triggered by this development. So the two are independent. We certainly recognize the concerns raised. However, we've tried to explain and attempt to explain that the two issues are not one and the same. They have that perception, but it is not.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Martin. Again, thank you, Mr. Miller, for your contribution this evening. Mr. Martin, is there any other delegation that wish to speak on this matter?
Yes, so the next registered delegation is Andrea Shinney, and I will also has a presentation that I will share her screen in momentarily.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you for sharing my presentation. I hope I have the lot numbers right. Now, I'm not so sure of that after hearing the intro to tonight's meeting or to the severance at hand, but hopefully we can just ignore that and move on. So Andrew, can you flip to my first slide, please? So this is just an overview of the concerns that I have related to the further development on the west end of Louisa. As Mr. Martin had just mentioned, he is not seeing these concerns as correlated or connected to further development, but I see them as directly connected to further development. And I'd like to go through all four concerns and why they are connected to any further development on the west end of Louisa, at least currently until the issues are addressed. Can we go to the next slide, please? So as mentioned already, the street width at Louisa and Foundry intersection does not meet current standard street allowances. My father and I went out and did some measuring around town. Louisa and Foundry Street is 21 feet wide, and that's at the narrow part. At the wider part, you're probably reaching around 26 less. So you're talking the difference of 4 to almost, pardon? 4 to 7 feet. That compared to the other end of Louisa, the east end, going on to Schneller, is 30 feet and 1 inch. And then we went around and we measured some of the newer subdivisions, which are all measuring at 31 feet. So there's a substantial difference there. Louisa doesn't have the standard road width, so further development, especially near the smallest end of the street, should not be approved until that is addressed, especially with these lots now exiting right at that intersection onto the Township Road. So next is the higher traffic volume. So these 4 units that are now existing, potentially 8 units, are going to be exiting from Louisa Street instead of Foundry, where they formerly were, where that property was formerly exiting off of. So the volume and proximity of the new driveways to this intersection will add to the already current issues that are there. A formal assessment of the road, the traffic, and the safety needs to be done before development is approved. I asked Mr. Martin about when the last time a proper assessment was done about the traffic. I'm not sure if it was done before Schneller was put in, or if it has been done since Samuel Foster was completed, or since Stifelmeyer was completed. But my other understanding that I got from talking to Mr. Martin was that the current construction would not trigger such an assessment, that you would need 100 cars kind of added to that area, or 100 car traffic added to that area to really trigger this kind of assessment. But when will that happen now? All the developments happened around Louisa and it still hasn't triggered an assessment. So I'm wondering if there is something on file about when the last formal assessment was done on the traffic that comes through Louisa. Is there anything on the record currently that we could look at, or is that a question that has to wait for later that would require the assessment or the people in this committee to review?
Mr. Martin, can you answer that question?
So I don't know the frequency, but the Region of Waterloo does do traffic analysis at all intersections on a fairly regular basis. I don't know, I could find out the date for sure, but both the transportation planning division at the region and engineering staff at the township have reviewed the applications, and if there had been a need, or if they felt that there wasn't adequate information to make a decision or make a comment at this point, they would have asked for more information. So I gather from that there were no concerns raised. So in terms of frequency or the last traffic analysis, I can certainly get back to that information back to you. I just don't know what it is at this point.
Furthermore, are there regulations for how far a driveway should be from an intersection like that?
The access locations are regulated both by the Region of Waterloo and the Township Wilmot Public Works and Engineering Department. An access permit was issued. I'm not familiar with all of the restrictions that are in place from both the region and township standpoints, but by virtue of the fact that an access permit was issued, it would have been issued in conformity with any applicable regulations.
I struggle with comments like that because so far nothing has been triggered, but I think this is long overdue. So I don't want to just count on others triggering this. I want to speak to making sure that these kinds of actions are triggered. If you can go to my next slide, please. So the drainage issue, which has already been brought up and I'm sure will be brought up again, but the only sidewalk on Louisa Street is often flooded over. This causes pedestrians spring, summer, fall, and winter to have to go onto the road to go around it. That has become quite a dangerous corner because the proximity to, again, where this flooded area is so close to the intersection. Cars come flying around and there's people out on the street. I've included some images shared with me by the gentleman that lives up front. So can we just flip through those, Mr. Martin? So here's an image looking down towards the east end of Louisa. Here's another one looking east. The next two are looking west, and I want you to notice how close they are to that intersection. So people are walking out on that road to go towards Foundry Street, and they are very close to the turning oncoming traffic. Thank you. So how does this drainage issue affect tonight's decision? I worry about the additional runoff that will come from the new property across the street. These two new 8-unit dwellings will require parking for, I believe, 12 people. I believe it's 1.5 spaces per unit. So that's 12 parking spots. You're talking about a giant driveway tarmac area, 2 large roofs. All of these are non-absorbent surfaces. All of these are going to add additional runoff to a street that is already struggling with the drainage. I'd like to see a sidewalk added on the other side too, because at this point, the new residents coming to these new builds are going to have to cross the road again to walk on a sidewalk that's flooded. I don't know if my family has, done some development in this area. I don't know if it's because of the size of development we've had to do, but we were the ones responsible for putting in the sidewalks. I'm wondering, is that the same for a smaller development like this? Would that be on the developer then to help cover the cost of putting in sidewalks on that side?
If sidewalks were planned for a street, then certainly those costs can be assessed to developments, no matter the scale. There weren't any plans to install sidewalks on this side of Louisa Street as part of that the street's profile. So in that regard, there is no trigger to have the developer install sidewalks on this side of the road.
So then I worry again that that was an oversight, and I'd like that to be reviewed before this is approved. And the street drainage, which I was told we might be adding a catch basin. I see that as a cheap kind of minimal cosmetic fix, because you put a catch basin on that side of the road, it's not going to catch anything. It's not also going to address the larger issue at hand, which is the grading and the already existent infrastructure that is not up to par and currently not able to handle the runoff that's already existed on the west end of Louisa. Next slide, please. So this is just my kind of conclusion. We have the opportunity to make these amendments to the west end of Louisa, these long overdue amendments. These concerns should have been addressed in the early planning of this new property development, as it will greatly impact many of these already existing issues on the west end of Louisa. The road width and the drainage issues should be addressed before this property development and before this severance is approved tonight. Next slide, please. So these are just some additional questions and concerns that I have for Baden and some of the development that's happening. I know that higher density housing is needed. As a young person who grew up in Baden, it was very hard to find something that was affordable for my husband and I to stay in Baden. We were so lucky to find this little bungalow on Louisa Street before really the market blew up. So I know that there's a need for higher density, but I do worry about these older properties. The house that was torn down was beautiful. Mr. Rose, you mentioned tonight about the change of your house that you spent many of your life in. I just am concerned that already on Foundry this year, we have lost 3 historical houses. In the past several years, we also lost the historical Beck House on Foundry. So we're changing the aesthetic and historical charm that Baden has, and on our main historical streets. So I'd like this committee to think of ways that they can start to protect some of these older residential buildings so that we don't keep losing them to higher density housing. Specifically, how can we plan ahead to other areas in Baden that could house some higher density housing, as opposed to all of them being on our main street and at the cost of some of our historical charm houses that make Baden really what it is. When I think of Baden, I think of Castle Kilbride, and I think of driving into a historical town. And I think it's odd that Baden doesn't really have a historical district or protection the same way that New Hamburg does. I'm also worried about the property on Snyder's Road that was part of the Harold Schmidt estate that the Reitmeyers had rented for many years. So just houses like that. That house was actually built by the same people that built my father's house that he still lives in. That's across from Castle Kilbride, and they're really important houses to Baden and kind of a symbol of our founders. So I'd like this committee to take some of that into consideration moving forward too. Thank you for your time. And I really appreciate you answering my questions and looking into the ones that we couldn't answer tonight.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We appreciate that. Mr. Martin, is there anyone else that wishes to address the committee on this matter?
There are, I don't know if you typically have asked if the committee has any questions that of this applicant, and I don't know if you want to ask that first before we move on.
Does the applicant wish to address any of the concerns?
Sorry, I don't mean applicant, I mean the presenter. Yeah, if anyone had any questions.
I'm sorry. Any questions of yes, of the presenter? Any member of the committee? Mr. Rowe?
I just have a comment, particularly on that last slide. If the presenter made her concerns, made the Wilmot Heritage Committee aware of her concerns, I think it would be quite useful.
Thank you for that suggestion. I will definitely bring it to their attention. I guess ultimately, even reaching out to them, we would still be wanting to get in touch with this committee as well, but I will definitely reach out to them. Thank you, Mr. Rowe, for that suggestion.
You're welcome.
Any other comments or questions from any other committee member? Seeing none. Thank you again for your presentation. And now, Mr. Martin, is there anyone else that wishes to address the committee on this matter?
Yeah, the next registered delegation is Dave Zadetsky. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that last name correctly. I apologize if I wasn't, but I am going to add him to the meeting right now. He's there, he just needs to unmute his mic.
Hello?
Yes, Mr. Sadensky. Are we pronouncing your name correctly?
It's Sadetsky. Close.
Okay.
Yeah, Sadetsky.
All right, thank you. Carry on, sir.
I'm actually the gentleman that lives across the street from the properties that are being built. The previous speaker there, those shots of the sidewalk were actually my sidewalk. I've lived here for quite some time now, and let me tell you, the water problem that we have here on this street is absolutely ridiculous. And when I talk to Andrew, typically when you build a new property, the foundation is usually higher than the road when they laser it. So my question is the side or the driveways, sorry, they're going to be obviously leaning towards the road because that's where you want the water to go. It's going to start flowing more water than I have onto my sidewalk. I'm just wondering what you guys are going to be doing about that. I thought that's a huge concern for me. And as well as we already have a cutout in the road for the neighboring property to my right, which every time you do a cutout in a road, it's not compacted as good as when they put the road in the first place. So what happens is it sinks and creates a pothole. And then that's where the water flows into the sidewalk even more is off that. Well, now you're going to be adding 2 more cutouts in the road in front of my house. All right. So you're essentially going to have 3 cutouts to tie into the servicing for the gas and the water. So that's going to be a potential problem as well. Those are my major concerns. And the traffic. You're going to put 2 fourplexes across the street here, which is 8 families, 2 cars a family. That's like 16 cars across the street in the same property on a corner with the driveway that you said the city looked into, what, 15 feet you said from the corner. I've been living here almost all my life and people can't turn this corner because you're forced to pull up to the stop sign to turn right onto Louisa. You got to stop before the crosswalk, but you can't see around the corner because of the 2 trees. So then they're forced to pull ahead. Well, then you watch the school bus drive over the boulevard because our street is only 21 feet wide. So I know a lot of this stuff to you guys, it has nothing to do because you keep telling everybody, oh, we had these people look at this, we had that people look at that. But I mean, why do I got water in my sidewalk then? If everybody looked at it, then why am I the only one salting and shoveling 6 inches of ice, especially in the springtime? Because that's when the warmer temperatures come, it turns into water. Then at nighttime, it freezes. I wake up in the morning and now it's ice. Well, then we got kids walking to school which is the bus stop, is on this street down the corner. So yeah, no, I oppose to this property 100%. Yeah. And visitors, where are they gonna park? It's a 21-foot street, parking on both sides. If I park my truck out in front of the street and I go put my wife's car on the other side of the street, you ain't getting through there. So where are these visitors for the people gonna park? My biggest concern is the water problem. You're gonna put two driveways together pointing towards my driveway, and I already got water problems, and then two more cutouts that are gonna sink, and everybody's gonna have to hear cars flying by with like speed bumps, because that's what we hear on the one that's there now. So that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments and your concerns. Are there any questions of the delegation from members of committee? I don't see any. Okay, thank you again, sir. Mr. Martin, is there anyone else that wishes to comment on this application?
Yes, the next delegation is Darlene Vanden. I'm not going to pronounce her last name correctly, but she knows who she is. So here I will add her to the meeting.
Hi, thank you. Hi, my name is Darlene Vanden Ackerboom. Good attempt, Andrew. Thank you for this opportunity to express my concerns regarding the development of the property at the corner of Louisiana and Foundry Street. My concerns involve two separate issues. One is ethics, the other is infrastructure. In September, when the house was sold, rumors started around town as to what was going to be happening with the site. On March 16th, when the demolition of the house started, I called the township office for clarification as to the rumors around town had been that several units were going to be constructed. I inquired about the process of a single house being replaced with multiple units and if this would not be considered a zone change. I was verbally told, and I don't remember the name of the person I spoke to at the time, but I was verbally told that the owners had a demolition permit, and for that, neighbors did not need to be notified. I asked what the property was currently zoned as, and I was told it was a single family dwelling, and if the new owners request a zone change, then the neighboring homes would receive a letter, a sign would be posted, and it would appear on the township website. January 25th of 2021, concrete forms for the foundation of a new home were dropped off at the property. I emailed the planning committee at the township office to inquire if the zoning was changing. The reply I received stated, a building permit has been issued in compliance with the existing zoning. The zoning permits a semi-detached dwelling with accessory apartments, which is what is being constructed. If anything is proposed that requires amendments to the zoning, or if a new lot were to be proposed, public notification would be provided. At this point, no such applications have been filed. I found it odd that in March of 2020, I was told the property was a single family dwelling, and now I was informed it permits a semi-detached dwelling with accessory apartments. On February 7th, a question was asked on a local social media group, wondering if anyone knows what is being built on the corner property. Several answers were given indicating multiple units. One person asked if they were for sale, and a reply was given that all 4 units were already sold. February 11th, I emailed my ward councillor requesting some information on the processes of development in Wilmot. He called me to discuss my questions and told me he would get some answers regarding my questions. February 12th, I received an email from the planning department referencing the email I had been sent a couple weeks earlier, and stated that the building permit was in compliance with the existing zoning, and the zoning permits a semi-detached dwelling with accessory apartments, which is what is being constructed. The email went on to say that they had just received an application to divide the ownership of the semi-detached dwelling that is under construction so that each half of the dwelling can be sold independently. This application will also result in a retained property that would have the potential to be developed with semi-detached dwelling as well. The sign was posted yesterday and the notice was also mailed. That is what I was told in the email. On February 16th, we received the letter dated February 11th from the planning department about the meeting today on March 3rd. In the email I received from the planning department at the township on February 12th, it stated, this week we received an application to divide the ownership. On the township website under the Committee of Adjustment, it says the Committee of Adjustment meets the first Thursday of every month. Applications are due a minimum of 25 calendar days prior to a meeting. Even if it was received on the Monday of that week, we have not yet reached the 25-day mark as of today. Close, but not quite 25. I have concerns with the process of these new multi-units popping up all over Basin. They seem to be premature in building before the proper permission has been granted. It seems odd that the foundations are poured and the concrete forms are left sitting at the construction site at 4 and 6 Louisa, as if we're already waiting for the next structure. The same thing is happening at numerous other locations around town. Some of them are already complete. When we were looking to buy our house in Basin 5 years ago, we were told by one of the developers in the new subdivision behind Castle Kilbride, that new development was put on hold in this township due to the infrastructure being at maximum capacity. Until the infrastructure was upgraded to accommodate more people, there would be no new building. While I understand that new construction at 4 and 6 Louisa Street is replacing an existing house, it is now being replaced with a semi-detached with the potential of accessory apartments. This equates to 2 or 4 units with retained land for the concept of future semi-detached dwelling beside it, adding another 2 or 4 units. Now we have gone from 1 house to 4 to 8 units. How is this not considered new building? It is increasing the number of units utilizing the same infrastructure. What upgrades have been put in place to accommodate the increased number of dwellings and residences in Wilmot? As a homeowner, would I receive the same allowances if I were to put up a garage or deck or fence without the proper permits and approvals in place before I started construction? Louisa Street at Foundry is a narrow roadway, as everyone else has mentioned as well, with an extremely high volume of traffic. When there is one vehicle parked on the street, I have seen many near misses from my house as I watch when people are turning onto Louisa from Foundry. The speed does not seem to be monitored on Foundry, and this just adds to the chaos along with the volume of traffic turning from Louisa onto Foundry. The existing sidewalk on the south side of Louisa has sunk, is lower than the roadway, and has become a storm water catch basin. It is often full of water and ice due to rain and melting snow. This is not a complaint about the neighbors who live by that section. They are constantly trying to maintain a safe sidewalk, but it is a never-ending battle. People then end up walking on the lawn or on the street to avoid having to trek through the water. More people are being added to our town, but the maintenance of the existing sidewalks and roadways does not seem to be keeping up with the increased demands and wear and tear. This area has become a hazard, whether you walk on the street or on the sidewalk. I am aware that the new government requirements involving the number of people residing per square hectare, and I know that we will be seeing many more high-density developments. However, I truly question how is Wilmot preparing for the increased number of dwellings that we are seeing with all the subdividing and multi-units going in where previously there were single-family dwellings. As a resident of Basin observing these construction sites, it appears to be of questionable ethics when buildings are already being constructed and then an application is submitted to the township requesting permission to subdivide. I hope my concerns are taken into consideration tonight when reviewing this application. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Members of the committee, any questions that you have of the presenter? Seeing none. But Mr. Martin, do we have anyone else that wishes to speak on this matter?
Yeah, we have one more registered delegation, and that is Vic Rocha, and I will add him right now.
Welcome, sir. You can begin your presentation.
Can everyone hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
The volume's not loud enough for him.
I don't believe he's online right now. Mr. Martin, is there a technical difficulty here?
He did ask if we could hear him, but it was very quiet. So I think he might be working on that right now.
Okay.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yes, hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
You're still very, very faint. We can hardly hear you.
Ready? How about now? Is it better?
A little bit.
Well, I'm having some technical issues, so it'll have to be what it is, I guess. I'm hoping you can hear me a little bit.
You're good.
It's better, but it's still not perfect, but go ahead.
Okay, well, that matches me, neither am I. So anyways, I'm going to change, I guess, all my notes and what I have written down to discuss with everyone. Now that all of the people preceding me had pretty much touched on every point that I had been researching. I guess as you can hear, the frustration of the people that live on this street is reaching a boiling point. I know that from council point of view, or sorry, from the committee point of view and the building department point of view, all of these people, we keep being told that their application was done properly, that all these traffic surveys, everything else has been done or is up to date or is a responsibility of the region of Waterloo or this or that. My biggest concern is, like everyone else on this street, I understand as a township, we're going to grow. I'm not opposed to growth. I will say I am opposed to the fact that I moved to a single family neighborhood. And now I see that every house that sells on my street is going to become semi-detached. And I'm going to go from living in a beautiful home that I spent probably the last 20 years renovating and investing money, paying taxes, to become I'm going to live in a complex with my family. So I'm concerned at the amount the township itself is looking at some of these builds and how they're affecting neighborhoods, how they're affecting everyone around them. We keep being told that, I know we're referred back to that this application is about a severance. It's not about our existing issues, but the reality is the properties that are being built as a result of what's currently there and the next severance and the next complex, they will have an impact, as you've heard from other people. Whether the committee agrees or not, they will have a water impact, which is a huge problem on this street. We will have a traffic impact. You're putting 4 driveways backing into complete chaos. I went around and measured 5 different intersections in Basin, varying from new subdivision to new subdivision, meeting old subdivision to Louisa Street. So the smallest subdivision, the smallest intersection in our area is Brewery and Louisa, as Mrs. Shinney pointed out, which is at 26 feet wide and 29.8 on the other side, where you're going to Louisa to 21 feet. It's unfortunate. I live here. I love living here, but it's dangerous and it's a public safety concern. And I don't know how, as a committee, we cannot look into this further before we proceed, or you guys cannot look into this further before we proceed, when you're hearing from the public who live right here that this is a huge public safety concern. Like, people are going to die on that corner. The speed is nuts. I know that the road might not have to do with the application in your mind, but it really does. So in conclusion, I guess I just basically want to say, one question I will ask of the committee would be, how do we go about getting more information or necessary studies before we agree to these permits? It's easy to sit here now in this meeting and tell us that everybody, every single step along the way met the criteria, but no one has numbers, no one has facts that they're showing us. Like, we're asking for measurement, we're not getting anything. And the other thing I would have to say is I do understand that we have to grow as a community. but I just think that there is a lot. The gateway is easier for a contractor to grow in this community than for a local resident to apply to have anything done to their own property. So I guess that's all I have to say. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. Members of committee, do you have any questions of the presenter? Seeing none. Mr. Martin, was that the last presenter that we have on this matter?
I see one of our attendees has raised their hand to ask to speak again. So if the committee is okay with that, I would add.
I don't think we need a motion on that. I think we can all agree that we'll accept that.
Okay, I'm going to add Andrea back into the meeting here.
Hello, thank you for having me back. Just wanted to add a couple additional questions for the committee, whether or not we can answer them tonight or if these have to be looked into, but I'd like to know the exact date on record when the zoning of the property was changed from a single family dwelling to a semi-detached. I'd also like to know, what does a semi-detached dwelling mean? Does that encompass a duplex, a quadplex? What is the term semi-detached, and how is that? Because when I think of semi-detached, I don't think of what's currently there. So I'm wondering if we can get some clarification on what that zoning means.
Mr. Martin. Mr. Martin?
I think Mr. Miller is prepared to answer these questions.
Mr. Miller?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so regarding your comments there, Andrea, the zoning has not recently changed in terms of this existing property. The township did recently complete a review of its zoning bylaw in about September of 2020. However, this didn't result in any changes to this property in particular. What was previously allowed was what's called a residential conversion. So when a property was constructed and split, the basement could be converted into an additional unit. We've kind of reworked the wording a little bit, and the update is now called an additional dwelling unit attached, which is essentially, again, a basement apartment. And again, to answer your question regarding what a semi-detached is, essentially it's split vertically, and then of course there's two units on either side, and then they share a common boundary line. In terms of the scope and definition in the township zoning bylaw, it is a little bit different than a duplex in terms of where the location of the entrances are provided. In an additional dwelling unit, the entrance needs to be provided from a side or a rear yard. In a duplex, it looks a little bit different. So that's kind of the distinction. But again, the zoning of this property has always been and remains to be zone 3, which permits a semi, a triplex, a single family dwelling, as well as additional dwelling units. And again, those changes were made as part of the recent review to the township zoning bylaw. Again, if Mr. Martin would like to add anything to that comment, but.
Yeah, I would like to know exactly what recent review means. I'd like a date on that. So like we said, or like Vic had brought up, some more facts instead of just some general statements. I'd like the actual date on that. Another question that I have, oh, sorry, Mr. Martin.
I'll just speak to that quickly before we move on. So the current zoning has been in place since 1983. As Mr. Miller had explained, the previous terminology has changed. So previously, the zoning in zone 3 would have allowed multiple different types of residential units, including a semi-detached dwelling and a residential conversion, which meant after the fact you could convert part of the building to contain another apartment unit. Through our zoning bylaw review that was completed and approved last year, we worked on it through 2018 and 2019 and was approved by council. I believe August of 2020 was when it was finalized. But essentially all that did with respect to it introduced this idea of residential conversions in all zones. So this property already allowed for it. Zone 3 already allowed, but it was extended to apply to all residential zones in order to comply with provincial policies. So it's no longer called a residential conversion. It uses terminology from the Planning Act, which refers to it as an additional dwelling unit, both attached or detached. So in this case, attached being within the unit itself. So again, the zoning's been in place since 1983. The prior zoning bylaw may have been the same, but certainly the current zoning's been in place since 1983 and nothing changed. Just the terminology, but the use itself has not been modified.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Just a question for my own clarification. Mr. Miller referred to you as Andrea. Is Andy a short form for Andrea Shinny?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies it for me because
Oh, sorry, Mr. Oath.
Yes.
I didn't mean to cut you off. Do you want to finish your thoughts? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, okay. That just so that I'm clear on who we're talking to.
Yeah.
And I appreciate your presentation, of course.
I have one last question, or actually more of a statement, I guess. I also want to have a double check on the count of number of days since this application was received. Website says 25 days before this meeting, and I don't believe it has been 25 days. That's just a minor note. I also wanted to mention that was brought up during this meeting. One other thing that I want to make sure is not overlooked, and I was trying not to say this before because I know that Vic had wanted to speak to this, was the catch basin and installing it on that side of the road where this development is being proposed is the higher, as mentioned by many people speaking tonight, it's the higher graded side of the road. So a catch basin wouldn't catch anything on that side of the road. And I do just one more time want to reiterate the need to kind of go over and reassess this and even get the developer involved in the potential of some much needed upgrades, including a sidewalk on that side of the street. I'd like to see that at least have the developer contribute to that instead of it being all township and taxpayer money. So that was just my final comments I'd like to make that weren't brought up yet. So thank you for, again, letting me come back, and I really appreciate your listening ears tonight.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Are there any questions from members of the committee to the last number of statements that Ms. Shinny made or in her presentation?
Want me to provide an answer just so on a couple of those items just before, and then if there's further questions, maybe we can ask those. So I believe the question regarding notice came up. So the instructions on the website are more from the applicant standpoint to ensure that we have things in time to meet the legislated requirements of a 14-day circulation for a consent. So the 25 days is not how much time the Planning Act requires. It's more to ensure that we have our applications in time. There are instances, depending on the complexity of an application, where we may ask for more time or less time, depending on the scenario. But certainly that's just a guideline to ensure we have applications in. That's not referring to the circulation timeframe. So Mr. Miller be able to verify that actual time when it was circulated, but it was, well, it would have been more than the minimum 14-day requirement. But perhaps if Mr. Miller has that date, it sounds like we would need a specific date, and we can certainly provide that here.
Sure. Yeah, just quickly to add to Mr. Martin's comments, circulation was provided on February 11th. The sign was posted on the same day. Notice was mailed out, and it was posted on the website that day. So that's about 14 days. Sorry, that's about 20 days before the meeting, which is, again, larger than the legislative requirement. But we always do strive to be higher than that minimum requirement. But again, as Mr. Martin touched on, the 25-day requirement doesn't impede on a lower time frame to circulate the application. It doesn't impede on our ability to circulate to GRCA, the Region of Waterloo, and other agencies in the public. Again, it's just so that we have ample time internally to process the application and the documents.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miller.
And if I could just comment briefly then on the drainage aspect. So we're not trying to get into this into too much detail because it does not really form part of this application. The existing semi-detached dwelling and lot grading and drainage plan were already approved because it's in compliance with the zoning. That said, our Public Works and Engineering Department did review it. There are no new catch basins proposed to be installed, but there are alterations to grading proposed to redirect water so that it can more adequately drain the property. Any existing issues with water on the street are that. They're existing and certainly have been noted, and we have brought that up further to the attention of our Public Works and Engineering Department for them to address through appropriate road maintenance as well as sidewalk maintenance, but again, does not tie into this specific application. It's my understanding that the existing catch basin at the front corner of the property, it appears that that is intended to take water from this site, recognizing that that side of the road would drain towards that side. So it's not anticipated, and certainly there are different opinions in that, but in reviewing the engineering submission and our Public Works and Engineering Department reviewing the same, it does appear that they're doing their best with an existing situation to address drainage issues. And ultimately that is the protocol that is used in all development, regardless of whether consent or any sort of development application is required. Block grading drainage plans are reviewed, and the criteria is to ensure that the drainage doesn't negatively impact neighboring properties. With respect to street drainage, if there are existing issues through maintenance review of those streets, our Public Works and Engineering Department would need to address that. And certainly the concerns have been noted and have been brought to their attention, and that department would be the correct department to deal with issues existing and plan for those works accordingly.
Mr. Martin, I do want to just say that when you are considering tonight's decision, we do have to take the pre-existing concerns on that end of the street into consideration. I also want some clarification on something you just said, because correct me if I'm wrong, but I had called my counselor, my ward counselor, Mr. Barry Fisher, this week. Actually, I think I had only called him on Monday or Tuesday, bringing some of the drainage issues to his attention as well. It was my understanding that a meeting with Public Works was only made after I made that phone call, and that there's a meeting on Friday regarding this street. So I do want it to be known that it's because of the voices speaking up right now that meetings are even happening, and that issues are being addressed and looked at for this development and for the improvements needed on that end of the street. Is that correct, that Public Works was not looking into this matter until that phone call was made?
I can't speak to their schedule. I certainly had discussions with them and they were aware of the issues already, but there may be further meetings being held again with that department. But you make a valid comment, and I would agree that certainly the opportunity to hear voices through these meetings would bring issues that weren't otherwise known, or if they are known, bring them further to the attention of the individuals responsible for that work. I think the distinction I'm making is that we recognize that and we hear the concerns, but this application doesn't trigger those works to be completed. And so that's where the separation is. So we appreciate the concerns been raised, and through the avenue that's appropriate, through the maintenance of the road, those issues can be addressed. But they aren't conditional on this development, as the zoning already allows the development to occur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin. And of course, that's always the case where different entities of the township may not be aware of a significant problem until it's brought to attention through a different venue, such as this. But then again, our venue is rather narrow in focus. We have to deal specifically with the Planning Act and what the rules and regulations are that we have to live within, and that may not include a number of other issues that come up. Hopefully the issues that are brought forward will be addressed, hopefully to everyone's satisfaction, but we all know that that's not necessarily always the way things work out, that you can't keep everybody happy all the time, unfortunately. Anyway, those are my comments. I'm going to turn it over now to members of committee for comment and or discussion. So
Sorry,
Members of
could I
committee.
interrupt
I'm sorry,
just for
Martin?
one more? We do have one other attendee.
Oh, I'm sorry.
They're not registered. They've requested to speak again, so I would add Mr. Rocha back into the meeting if that's.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry about that. I wasn't aware of that.
No problem. Yeah.
Mr. Rocha, are you there?
We can barely hear you. It's
I can't hear anything at all.
less than a whisper at this point.
We know he's speaking, but there's nothing that's clear to understand.
I'm not detecting any sound at all, actually. Is anybody picking up sound?
So we're having a similar issue to what we had the first time Mr. Rocha spoke. Perhaps whatever you did, Mr. Rocha, last time to increase the audible volume of your voice, last time that did work, that we could hear you a little more clearer and louder. That's the issue we're having, though, is it's just very faint again.
Can you hear me? You can hear me now?
Yeah, that's a little bit better.
Okay, so I did have one other question that I missed.
I'm having a great deal of difficulty hearing.
We'll repeat the question for you, Mr. Roth, in a sec. We'll let him speak, and then we can reiterate the question so you can hear.
Okay, my question is there a plan at that same intersection to future development across the road? Is that a plan to turn that street, Andrew, tie it into the same intersection as Louisa Street through to future development?
You're talking would directly across. There is the extension. Sorry, Wayne. The question was: is there a plan to extend Louisa Street across Foundry Street? Certainly, the township owns a road allowance on the opposite side. There are no current applications to reconstruct that roadway, but there is designation in place that should they want to proceed. So behind Enid and Harold's house. That Darlene lives in now, I believe. There are existing lots on an old plan of subdivision there that have frontage on this road allowance. The road would need to be built to a municipal standard and service standard if that were to be developed. So I guess the short answer is there is potential that could happen. Certainly the intersection would need to be looked at through any kind of formalization of that roadway. So that may, in addition to the roadworks already planned by the region, should something be proposed in the future, that intersection would also be looked at through any kind of extension of that road.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Did other members of committee have trouble with the sound? Is it just coming directly to Mr. Martin and to Mr. Miller? Or I know my hearing's not the best anymore, but
I could not hear him.
okay. All right, so then thank you very much. So now I don't have to worry about making an appointment with the hearing aid specialist tomorrow. Anyway,
did I reiterate that question, Mr. Rocha?
Have we heard of everyone now, Mr. Martin?
I'm just going to wait to make sure that we did get all of his question there.
Okay.
Yes, you did answer my question, Andrew. Thanks.
Okay. All right. I see that Andy Shinney has raised her hand to speak again. If I will add her back to the meeting.
Thank you. I don't want to make the meeting take up too much more time, but I do want to reiterate one last time before a motion is made that the concerns raised tonight and brought to this committee should influence and impact the decision on whether or not Louisa's infrastructure can handle another property and thus a severance that would allow another property to be built. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Okay. I'm going to turn it now over to members of committee for comments or questions or concerns. Members of committee?
Chairman, can I ask?
Ms. Lalonde.
I have a question.
I'm sorry. I saw Ms. Lalonde's hand first and then Mr. Bowman.
Okay. May I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay. So I've listened to all of the persons that spoke and have concerns. If I was living on Louisa Street, I totally get it, and I would have those concerns as well. My question is, before the builder made this application, was all of this water issue not taken into consideration at the initial development application to develop this property into these multi-family dwellings? I guess my question is to Mr. Miller or Mr. Martin.
Who wants
Being
to
Mr. Miller not answering, I'll chime in here, which is fine. Okay. So certainly, the lot grading and drainage plans are required prior to any building permits being issued. That said, there's a balance of looking at what a property's responsibilities are versus existing deficiencies in a road or sidewalk. So as we've heard, the concerns with water and drainage and sidewalk concerns are existing. So to a certain extent, those matters need to be addressed through the appropriate avenues of road maintenance and sidewalk maintenance, and aren't a responsibility of the individual building on their property. Similarly, if anyone was proposing a building, we wouldn't suggest that their responsibility is to improve the roadway. That would be different if they were proposing a development that required intensification beyond what the zoning would already allow for. So there is a distinction there. If they were proposing a development that wasn't in full compliance with the zoning, there may be a different criteria and different studies that would be required because the use is more intense than what was already contemplated by the zoning. But that isn't the case here, given the zoning allows the uses being proposed.
But that leads me to another question. Should that be permitted under the situation that exists now?
I think I might phrase
allow it because it's already in place. You can't turn it down. You're kind of stuck.
Well, I think I would maybe phrase this: if you owned the property and you decided your house had reached its end of life and you were to take it down and you came in to apply for a building permit to replace that house, and there were existing issues with the road, would your expectation be that you'd have to reconstruct the roadway to accommodate your house? Because the zoning, and I think that's to a certain extent the perspective you have to look at. And I recognize that they're replacing it with something that wasn't on the property, but they are replacing it with something that the zoning already allows for. So that's perhaps where the biggest distinction.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bowman.
Yeah, I do want to say thank you to everyone that showed up, all the delegates. We are listening. We do understand the frustrations. I grew up on a street that had a farm in New Hamburg that had a farmer's field across from it. And when I was 10, it turned into a subdivision. And so I do understand the frustrations and where it's coming from, and the time to put together that presentation is well worth it. And there's avenues if the outcome of this decision isn't favorable for you, there's avenues to appeal it. And I'd encourage you to do so if that's what happens. I do have a question though, that I guess Mr. Miller, I would let you take this one. If by chance they didn't have the severance, that semi-detached dwelling could still be built, and you could only have one owner, obviously, of the property, but you'd still have the same building on site with 2 units on it. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. Yeah. So as is currently proposed, it meets all the required setbacks. The exterior side yard, flankage yard, which is the side yard abutting a street, complies. The parking requirements are met, and again, the zoning does permit a semi-detached dwelling. So again, this is dividing ownership of such semi-detached dwelling so that it can be bought, sold separately, and conveyed individually.
So I guess my point being, regardless of the decision being made, that building can still be built, and because appropriate permits have been obtained, and you'll have the same building there. It just will be owned by one person, not two, I guess. Yep.
Yeah.
This, sorry, Mr. Roth, go ahead.
Go ahead, Mr. Miller. I have a comment to make, but go ahead, Mr. Miller.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, largely this application is obviously to do with the severance of the land. There's no, obviously there's been some land compatibility issues that have been raised, but it's not contemplating land use of this property. It's strictly contemplating division of the land. So again, the zoning does permit that. There's no regulations in the zoning that are proposed to be amended in any way. It is also contemplating the development potential of the vacant parcel. Obviously that's recognized, but again, the zoning, what's being constructed is already permitted under the zoning.
Thank you. My comment was that in terms of a single ownership as to split ownership, pride of home ownership, I still think means a lot in our areas, as opposed to a rental situation, which would certainly be possible in this particular type of situation. It's a minor point, but it's something that I still think pride of ownership is an important factor here in Ontario. Okay, any other comments or questions?
And
Mr. Rowe.
Yes, me. And it's just a question. On the sketch, it has possible future semi-detached building on the vacant part of the land. On the retained land, it says future semi-detached dwelling concept. Are we to think that there's likely to be an application to build something there?
Yeah, so yeah, thanks, Mr. Rowe, for your question. So certainly in preliminary talks with the applicant, they have expressed their intentions, and that's what they plan on building. The zoning, again, does allow for that. You know, in terms of transparency, it was included on the sketch to show that what the likely development of that parcel, that vacant retained parcel, will be. So again, that was included on that sketch. And at that time, if they do again wish to divide ownership of that again proposed semi, then we will return to the Committee of Adjustment for another application for consent again to sever that piece.
But otherwise, there's quite likely to be an application for a building permit. You have to go through all of the things that you normally do for that, which would perhaps trigger some action by the roads department. I'm thinking of the road. I mean, it's not up to us to say yes or no to anything except that the severance of the land.
Yes. Yeah, sorry, Mr. Rowe. So circling back to Mr. Martin's earlier comments relating to road work and what triggers the basically the requirement or the need to look at issues such as traffic and road upgrades. Again, if the property were to be in full compliance with the zoning regulations, and that's what the property permits, obviously a lot of concerns have been noted, and as such, obviously we'll be taking them to Public Works Department, and they will look at a subsequent lot grading and drainage plan, and access permits will also need to be issued for that vacant retained parcel for driveway accesses. So any issues such as visibility would be addressed at that time. But again, circling back to Mr. Martin's earlier comments regarding road infrastructure upgrades and the triggers for that work.
Thank you. Are there any comments or questions? Mr. Miller.
I just had a question for either Andrew or Cameron. If the severance didn't go through, and as we said, one owner would own the semi-detached building on one parcel of land. We had the application earlier today where a secondary accessory building was built up to, or could be built to, gonna quote, 75% of the size or something like that. Could that happen here, even if the severance wasn't allowed?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Miller, for your question. Yeah, so the zoning again does allow for both an additional dwelling unit detached and an additional dwelling unit attached. So the zoning allows for both, and that's modeled after provincial policy. So again, if the severance application, were not to go through tonight, and the applicant would to pursue something different, it would permit an additional dwelling unit detached to be constructed, which could be built up to 75% of the lot coverage of the dwelling unit.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions? Well, then
I do see a hand, and typically after the discussion point, we don't usually have a discussion, but I do see a hand here. If you would like to hear from the one of the delegations would like to speak again, I'll leave that to the committee to decide.
Well, again, it's sort of out of our format, but I think we can, if someone wants to speak, we'll certainly allow it.
Okay. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Rowe, for letting me speak again. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. I really appreciate the questions brought forward there by the committee. That was really interesting to hear that even without the severance, that an additional dwelling that is a quadplex could already happen on that single lot of land. I guess I just wanted to go back to the comments made earlier, which was that Public Works and other assessments had already deemed that this development could happen. Yet Public Works hadn't taken into consideration a lot of the things that we have brought to your attention tonight. I think it was Mr. Roth that had asked, were these accounted for when the initial approval went through? So I'm just wondering, what would the next course of action be if the severance is approved tonight? And when will the road and drainage issues be taken in consideration before approving such developments in the future?
To briefly respond to that, timing would need to come through the 10-year capital forecast if it required significant infrastructure improvements to the road, if that were to be planned. Certainly maintenance provisions such as a sidewalk, there is an annual sidewalk maintenance program. Usually that deals with heaved or cracked sidewalk panels and doesn't specifically address water standing. But when budgets will allow, they would improve those areas as well through that sidewalk program. So ultimately, yeah, these concerns have been highlighted. There was a review completed through the review of the application by both, as we had mentioned, transportation engineering at the region of Waterloo, as well as Public Works and engineering, to determine what requirements, if any, would be triggered by this with respect to vehicle movements and any infrastructure improvements to allow the servicing of those. Those comments did not come up. Certainly, the comments have been raised through the public process. For those who are familiar with the intersection, which I am, I used to walk that road on my way to work when I lived in Baden. But in any event, certainly those issues will be further brought to the attention of Public Works and Engineering for further consideration through their planning and capital forecasting for road improvements, if there's existing deficiencies that need to be addressed. Preliminary comments that I received back from Public Works and Engineering was there was no forecasted reconstruction of that section of Louisa Street at this point, but they could look at maintenance provisions to correct existing issues. So it is on their radar. As you suggested, it sounds like there may be some meetings that the ward councillor has brought up, and certainly that's how these sorts of things would be addressed. And hopefully, existing issues can be rectified. In as much as possible, this development will be dealing with the drainage that is produced from that property to ensure that there's no new or negative impacts from that development. But existing issues with the road and sidewalk are something that would need to be addressed through the review process for like any other road by the Public Works and Engineering Department.
I just want to say, as a citizen, it is concerning to think that these huge issues that we're having were overlooked when this development was initially approved.
I wouldn't say their issues were overlooked. What I've been trying to explain is they're not triggered by this development. So they're not overlooked issues. This development doesn't trigger any improvements. And I understand where you're coming from, what you're saying, but I'm trying to explain the difference there. So it's not that any of these concerns were overlooked. It's that they aren't triggered by this particular development. Certainly, when there'll be improvements to the asphalt in the area where they provide servicing connections. Some of the processes that have changed is the depositing system and actually taking a pavement degradation fee, so that in the event that the breakdown of that asphalt were to occur over a certain period of time, there's money there to fix those sorts of things. So there are things that are new that department has worked on to ensure that infilling developments and ultimately any impacts on the road infrastructure are paid for by that development. So there are those provisions in place. I think Mr. Rocha had concerns about, or no, it wasn't Mr. Rocha, it was one of the neighbor across the road rather, with speed bumps and the degradation of asphalt, all those sorts of things. So the impact that they are directly creating by cutting into the road, those sorts of measures are being addressed through the permitting process. But as far as existing infrastructure issues, they're not overlooked. They're just not triggered by this application.
Okay, thank you. I think we're at the point now, members of committee. The recommendation, or before I go there, are there any other comments or questions that any member of committee has? If not, the recommendation in front of us is that the Wilmot Committee of Adjustment approve submission B0321 affecting part lot 87, lots 88 and 89, plan 627.
It's like
So you all have that information in front of you?
I think,
so
I think Steve Miller had a question perhaps, but I see that he's maybe disconnected from the meeting here. So maybe just give him just a second to reconnect.
Sorry about that.
It could very well have been that he had to leave the meeting too. He had his hand up, but I don't know what.
Yeah, because he's disappeared here on us. What would be your suggestion, Mr. Martin, in moving forward? Is it temporary, or do you think he has left the meeting?
Let me just, if we just pause for just a minute, I'll see if I can get a hold of him by cell.
Okay. We've temporarily lost Miss Lalonde as well. Oh, there she is.
I was having a sip of my drink. I didn't want to do it in public.
He's back.
Mr. Miller.
All right, I lost laptop power there.
We can hear you, Mr. Miller. We can't see you.
Well, you're better off that way anyway.
Sorry, we weren't sure if you were telling us you were leaving or if you had questions. So we just paused. So
no, sorry, my laptop was dying, and it said I had 10 minutes. I thought I was good, and then it said no, you don't, and shut down. So
okay, so you're all set. You don't have it. Anyway, I had just read. I don't know if you heard, but I just read the recommendation that is in front of committee that we approve the submission. So that's a recommendation in front of us. Is there someone that will bring it to the floor, or which direction does committee wish to proceed?
I would like to move the motion forward.
Mr. Bowman has been moved by Mr. Bowman. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Mr. Miller. Now, is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor? Ms. Lalonde, I didn't see your hand. Is your hand there? You're okay. I'll oppose. Okay. The motion is carried. Thank you all for your participation this evening. The next item of business is we need to approve the minutes of our last meeting. Moved by Mr. Rowe. Did I see your hand there, Mr. Rowe? I did. Seconded by Ms. Lalonde. Any discussion? All in favor? That motion is carried. Thank you all for attending. Is there any information on our next monthly meeting, Mr. Miller?
Yeah, so we do have one application that is in and likely will be considered at the April meeting. So we will likely hold a meeting for that, and we're anticipating probably some more coming in. The tentative date would be April 7th, typical Wednesday, first Wednesday of the month. So as long as that works with most people and we have enough members to hold a meeting, that's probably going to be the date.
It's fine by me.
Works for me.
Works for me.
Yep, it should be okay.
Yes, Mr. Miller, good for you? Okay, we're all cool. So it'll be April the 7th then, and we'll go from there. Thank you again all for your participation this evening.
Thank you.
Please stay safe and get your vaccination as soon as you can.
Yep.
I'm in line pretty quick here, I think. I've been registered, so I just have to wait for my date. Yes, I have been.
Good.
Well, you
Good
know,
for you.
the older people, the older guys in the neighborhood put theirs first, you know. So
You're not,
Anyway.
you're not anywhere close to 80, are you,
how
Mr.
about you,
Bill?
Peter? You should be in line. Huh?
But the fact of the matter is, I've already had the first.
Well, good
I've
for you.
already had
Good,
the
good for you.
Good for
Yeah, that's
you.
great.
Wow.
Okay, God bless and stay safe.